Lori back from Kid Museum to show you a few more sewing techniques. Today we're going to learn how to sew a whip stitch and a blanket stitch. So let's get started. Let's take a look at a whip stitch. Now a whip stitch is a good stitch for stitching two pieces of fabric together on the edge. I folded mine over so you can see it a little better. And you're basically going around the top, kind of binding the top of the fabric. So let's take a look at how I would do it. I've got two pieces of fabric here. I've got my thread, and I'm going to start by going back right here to front. Same way I would start a running stitch. Now, instead of going front to back, I'm going to flip around the top and continue to go back to front. It's important to make sure the tail end of my thread is going over the top of the edge of the fabric. You may need to readjust it a few times before you pull the stitch in. There we go. So see how I'm going in the same direction with my needle each time? So now I'm not going from the front, I'm going from the back. Back to front. Make sure that tail end is nice and clear. And again, as we stitch, you might have to pull it around a little bit to make it lay the way you want it to. And we're just kind of going over the top of that raw edge of the fabric. Pull through another stitch. Make sure, especially on corners, it likes to try to go around the corner. Remember, it's back to front every time with a whip stitch. Now, unlike a running stitch, this stitch really only works on the edge of a fabric. A running stitch can be used anywhere, but a whip stitch always goes over the top of the edge. If you try to do a whip stitch on the middle of a fabric, you might have some problems. But what's going to do is create a nice edging top to your fabric and hold it nicely in place. This could be really useful if you're making, say, a pillow or a stuffy. So let's do one more stitch, pull it around the top, and make sure it lays where I want it to. So you don't want to pull it too tight. If you pull it too tight, you're going to see the top of the fabric start to scrunch up. And there we have a whip stitch. Remember, we're going over and over, kind of like a loop around the top. Now the next step up from a whip stitch is called a blanket stitch. Now a blanket stitch is just like a whip stitch over the top, but we're going to have this nice line along the top. It's even stronger than a whip stitch, and it looks really nice and decorative. It can be a really pretty thing to add when you're stitching fabric together. So the blanket stitch is going to look a lot like our whip stitch when we start. I'm going to take my two pieces of fabric. I've got my needle in there. I'm going to go over from back to front just like I was doing a whip stitch, but that tail end, I'm going to wrap it around my needle, kind of going through that loop. And now I'm going to pull my thread through. Now the first one is not going to really want to go to the top. It's going to look at an angle. But now let's do another stitch. I'm going to come over and go back to front, take my tail end, go around my needle, so I'm going through that loop, and pull through. And I'm going to pull it up away from my fabric. Not too tight. If I do it too tight, it's going to start to roll. But there we go. Let's do one more. I'm going to go back to front, wrap my tail end around my needle, pull through, and pull up and away from my fabric. Now, as you can see, it's starting to create that flat line here. Let me put a piece underneath. See that flat line? That's the start of our blanket stitch. So let's go again. We're going to go back to front, wrap the tail end around our needle, pull up and out to the side. A blanket stitch is a really useful stitch for what's called applique. It's when you can put one piece of fabric onto another and add like a little border to it. It can look really pretty. Looks like I have a little tiny knot. I'm going to go ahead and just pull that out, smooth it out, and pull back through. When you're sewing, sometimes your thread will get tangled up. Make sure you're going slow, and if you see a knot start to form, just kind of wiggle it with your fingers. There we go. Let's do another. We're going to go back to front, take that tail end and wrap it around the needle, pull up and out. And there we've started to get a blanket stitch.